For those that don't know about the Illinois State Society, it was founded in 1854. I'm the president, by the way, Howard Marks, to foster, encourage social and fraternal relations between Illinoisans living here in the nation's capital, Illinoisans living in diaspora here in Washington, D.C. It's the oldest among the 55 state and territorial societies. We believe that Abraham Lincoln was an early member. The inspiration for today's webinar came from Rod Ross, who in past decades has organized Illinois State Society events in Statutory Hall in the US Capitol, at Arlington National Cemetery, at Union Station, at the Lithuanian Embassy here in Washington, and at National Cathedral. Excuse me. This past year, Rod rejoined the board of the Illinois State Society to help facilitate reconciliation between Republicans and Democrats, between whites and blacks. Today's webinar will be the first of 3 Rod has set up, with 2 other programs focusing on individuals celebrated by others as having problematic statues. On May 11th, we'll hear from Gary Eckelbarker on someone largely forgotten today, except on Memorial Day, but prominent enough to be mentioned in the 4th verse of the Illinois State song, along with Lincoln and Grant. And that, of course, was John A. Logan. On June 8th, we'll hear from Charles Calhoun, who will discuss the successes of the Grant administration. Yes, they did have successes. And I am pleased to report that we just learned this morning that on May the 25th, U.S. Representative Robin Kelly, a Democrat who represents the South and South suburban areas of Chicagoland, will be with us, and she's newly elected head of the Illinois Democratic Party. And our co-sponsor today is the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. Next slide. So in February, the Chicago Monuments Project released a list of 41 statues that it said should be considered for public discussion, including possible removal. Among them were 5 statues of Abraham Lincoln located in public spaces in the city of Chicago. Next slide, please. These are the 5 statues in various parks within the city and showing him at different stages in his life. And these 5 statues are under review right now. Next slide, please. The Lincoln statues were specifically selected according to the project's website for this reason, and this is lifted directly from this quote from the Monuments Project website. Lincoln's legacy as a statesman and anti-slavery figure stands side by side with his historical role as an escalator of Indian removal. The Dakota War mass hanging in Minnesota in 1862, coupled with the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, are 2 prominent examples of the course of Indian-state relations during his presidency, end of quote. And with that, I will turn the program over to Dr. Rod Ross. Rod, the program is yours. Are you muted?
Thank you, Howard. I'm Rod Ross, a native son of Illinois, born in Chicago, raised in Batavia, educated at Knox College in Galesburg and at the University of Chicago. My career here in Washington, D.C. was as an archivist with the National Archives and Records Administration. As Howard mentioned, today's Zoom presentation on the case for continuing to honor Lincoln in statuary is a joint effort of the Illinois State Society of Washington, D.C., and the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. Ours is a response to the naming by a Chicago commission of 5 Chicago Lincoln statues to the problematic list of statues under review. In considering why we should honor Lincoln in public today, we will discuss key acts taken during the latter half of 1862 that bring into sharp relief the essence of Lincoln's leadership and values. This period was a turning point during which Lincoln revealed his convictions and tenacity that have contributed so much to our national culture and identity. Joining me for our panel are David J. Kent, John O'Brien, and Debbie M. Jackson. David is the author of an extraordinary biography of Lincoln to those with little or no previous knowledge of the man. His heavily illustrated volume is entitled Lincoln, the Man Who Saved America. A lifelong Lincoln researcher and board member of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, David is a vice president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. In a February TV interview, a co-chair of the Chicago Commission, when asked, why was Lincoln on the list? Her response, in effect, was, it's complicated. She praised Lincoln for his role with emancipation, but said that his record on Indian removal was less than sterling. I admit to being puzzled by what she was referring to until I realized she was talking about the forced march of the Navajo to Bosque Redondo in the New Mexico Territory. David will make mention of Bosque Redondo, but his focus regarding Native Americans, with his emphasis on the late 1862, will be on the fighting in Minnesota that resulted in the mass execution of 38 Dakota warriors. Next up will be John O'Brien. John is president of the Lincoln Group. He's a former hospital administrator and is a licensed TC tour guide. He also serves as Lincoln historian at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church here in Washington, where Lincoln worshiped during his tenure in the White House. John has written and spoken about how Lincoln sought to use Protestant theological doctrine to effectively connect Union war aims with popular notions of God's will. John will discuss Lincoln's thoughts and actions leading to his issuance of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Our final panelist will be Debbie M. Jackson. Debbie is a native of Chicago who holds degrees from Eastern Illinois in Charleston and the University of Illinois, Champaign. She recently retired after 30 years as a project officer with the Public Health Service. A performer and playwright, she is a founding writer of the DC theater scene and a member of the Black Women Playwrights Group. Like David J. Kent, she is a vice president with the Lincoln Group. Currently, she's working on expanding her article about Lincoln and theater that appeared in the Lincolnian. It will be up to Debbie to make the case for why Lincoln deserves recognition. She'll begin her part of the program with a dramatic reading from this book of the 1879 poem by native son of Illinois, John Willis Menard, to President Lincoln on issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. John O'Brien will conclude the presentations with a summary statement, at which point we'll open the floor for Q&A led by David J. Kent. With that, I give you David J. Kent.
Thanks, Rod. As Rod mentioned, one of the reasons offered for questioning why we honor Lincoln with statues is his record on Native American populations. And To understand Lincoln's role, we really need to consider the existing Indian system in place when Lincoln took office. And it really began when Europeans first set foot on this continent. They treated immediately native populations as savages to be dominated or eliminated. So these racist beliefs and practices were codified under President Andrew Jackson with the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which directed that Southern Indian populations be pushed westward to free up arable land for cotton plantation owners. So the most obvious and devastating example of this is known as the Trail of Tears, in which as many as 100,000 Indians from the 5 civilized tribes were forcibly relocated to what is now Oklahoma. Thousands of them died along the way. Now, this Indian system was promulgated versus a series of treaties between Congress and Native American tribes, in which the tribes agreed to give up land in return for food, clothing, gold, and protection against their enemies, which included other Indian tribes as well as white settlers. Payments were provided by the government to Indian agents responsible for dissemination to the tribes, with local traders providing the food and supplies. So effectively, Indian populations became wards of the state. Unfortunately, this system was rife with corruption right from the beginning. Agents were put in place under the patronage system, which was by local congressmen, and often colluded with the traders to cheat the Indians out of their federal subsidies, which of course led to widespread poverty and hardship. And yet there was little government interest in changing this system because it benefited the very congressmen who would need to pass the new laws. So this is the system that Lincoln inherited. It is accurate to say Lincoln did little to change the system that had been in place for so long. This isn't surprising. 7 states had seceded before he was even inaugurated. 4 more soon followed suit. On his first day in office, Lincoln was forced to decide what to do about Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, whose anniversary we just passed. With the Confederacy firing on that fort, the Civil War began. Now, as John will discuss further, emancipation of enslaved African Americans was a critical element in winning the war and preserving the Union. Slavery had been a focal crisis for decades. And while there was a significant percentage of the country actively working to end slavery, there was no similar public support for reforming the ongoing Indian system. In fact, most white Americans concurred with the forced removal and decimation of native populations as a way to make room for whites to take Indian lands as we moved westward. Second slide, please. Which gets us to the latter half of 1862. Frustrated with this constant disrespect and outrageous cheating by agents, traders, and the system itself, in August of 1862, a band of Dakota Indians led by Little Crow began an uprising in which they attacked and killed hundreds of white settlers in Minnesota. More than 800 settlers were killed over several weeks before U.S. Army retaliation killed many Dakota, and hundreds more were surrendered or were captured. These were tried under military tribunals, and 303 Dakota were sentenced to be executed for participating in massacres against whites. Now, by law, any death sentences issued by military commissions must be signed off on by the president. And whereas most previous presidents would simply have rubber stamped all the sentences, Lincoln ordered all of the case materials be sent to him for review. Over several weeks, he and a small team reviewed all 303 case files, and they found that many of the trials were inadequate, and the standard for being guilty of murder was simply participating in battles. So Lincoln decided that a stricter standard of law was required, and after this review, commuted the sentences of 265 Dakota, approving only those sentences where the trial record adequately demonstrated that these remaining 38 were guilty of participating in massacres, rape, or murder. Now, these sentences were carried out in December of 1862 in what has been called the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Less publicized is that the reprieves to the 265 men constitutes the largest mass clemency of people in U.S. history. So Lincoln's humanitarian instincts had won out over expediency. Now, two other incidents are mentioned with respect to Lincoln's Indian policy, although he really played no significant role in either case. Following this long-held removal policy, which has been going on for decades, Navajo Indians were forced to relocate across the width of what is now New Mexico to Bosque Redondo in what has been known as the Long Walk of the Navajo. Now, the first group of Navajo to leave actually began their journey in August of 1864, but more than 50 groups were relocated from that time until the end of 1866, a full year and a half after Lincoln's assassination. So in all, about 9,000 Navajo were relocated, with maybe 200 dying during transit. The other incident, it occurred on November 29th, 1864 in Colorado. Here again, local military leaders attacked and destroyed a village of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, killing and mutilating between 70 and 500 people, most likely probably in the 100 to 150 range, 2/3 of whom were women and children. So this Sand Creek massacre was so shocking that even the US Army and the federal government acknowledged it as an unprovoked massacre by American troops. It led to military investigation and a congressional debate about reforming the Indian system, although no substantive changes were made at that time. Now, given this long-standing Indian system policy, the lack of any kind of public or congressional interest in changing it, and the all-consuming focus of the Civil War, it's simply unreasonable to expect that Lincoln would do much to reform the existing system. However, he did become aware that reform was necessary. He mentioned in his first annual message to Congress in December of 1861 that there was concern that the Confederate insurrection was affecting Indian relations, and many were arguing that Confederacy was instigating uprisings to pull US Army troops away from the military front. In fact, many of the 5 civilized tribes were helping the Confederacy, were fighting for the Confederacy, and they also had about 8,000 enslaved African Americans themselves in what is now Oklahoma. So in his 1862 annual message the following year, Lincoln suggested that Congress should consider remodeling this Indian system. He reiterated this suggestion in his 1863 and 1864 annual messages, but Congress didn't take any action. Lincoln also promised Episcopalian Bishop Henry Benjamin Whipple, who was one of the very few advocates for the sentence Dakota, that he would prioritize reform of the Indian system in his second term, after the Civil War was over. Now, Lincoln's adherence to the stricter standard with a Dakota 38 was despite political and military considerations that would have provided cover to carrying out executions for all of those sentences. Most white Minnesota settlers believed that all of the original 303 should have been executed. In fact, that all Dakota villages should be destroyed and all Dakota should be killed or forced out of the state. Lincoln was warned that going against this rabid public sentiment and political expediency, he would lose votes for Republicans in the next election, which is exactly what occurred. But demonstrating his humanitarian and legal values, Lincoln told Minnesota Governor Ramsey that, quote, he could not afford to hang men for votes. Third slide, which shows the modern day reconciliation ride done by Dakota Indians in Minnesota. So it's true that Lincoln failed to reform this long-standing and inherently corrupt system that had been treating Native American populations abhorrently for decades, a system that reflected the deep-seated and long-standing racism of the white majority. Reforming this system would require a fundamental change in public attitude, as well as convincing Congress to change a system they found politically beneficial. Simply replacing a few corrupt Indian agents wouldn't have been sufficient. Reform would take a concerted effort that was impossible during the existential threat to the country the Civil War created. Now, we look back on it today, and the Dakota 38, the Sand Creek Massacre, the long-standing Indian removal policy, and the overall corruption in the Indian system, like slavery, does remain a blot on our national history. And while we in the present all wish Lincoln had done more, no one could have met the impossible expectation of systemic reform during that time period. We honor Lincoln today for all that he did achieve. We cannot dismiss everything Lincoln accomplished because he couldn't accomplish everything. Rather, it is for us, the living, to rectify the lingering systemic discrimination that continues to impact our Native American citizenry. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to John O'Brien here.
Well done, David. Thank you very much. Abraham Lincoln is widely regarded as the greatest American president. At a critical moment in our history, he corrected a paradox in our Constitution. He devised and managed the process that eliminated the contradiction that confused our declared national purpose, that all people are created equal. President Joe Biden recently reminded us of the principle that politics is the art of the possible. The most powerful and necessary vision can go nowhere without the votes necessary to be implemented. There have been a few gifted people who have been able to advance noble objectives through the power of their vision and the creativity of their politics. Though they are rarely blameless in the full scope of their lives, they are people who provide great examples of leadership and moral courage, and who deserve our recognition. Their presence in the public square reminds us of critical moments in our history that inspire others to imagine how the world can be made better. What does it take to change a nation? There has been no better example of the positive use of our politics to achieve a great vision than Lincoln. In the 1850s, when the slave power of the South was at its greatest, Lincoln had a vision for a political movement that would reverse the growth of American slavery and put it on a path to eventual extinction. This movement was not sworn to abolition. That would have required too many Americans in both North and South to confront and overturn deep-seated social and religious beliefs that disparaged people of African descent. Rather, Lincoln brought together a range of views and interests that had one idea in common. It was that the US Constitution did not condone the expansion of slavery into newly created states, and restricting slavery would surely lead to its rapid doom. To keep this coalition together, Lincoln built his case on the foundation of respect for both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The fundamental law of our still new country was unique in the world. It was to create a government by the people themselves, not a king. But important as this fundamental law, this Constitution was, it was but the framework for protecting the greatest of principles, that all people are created equal. Lincoln once used the analogy that the Constitution was the frame of silver around the picture of the apple of gold. The apple was the principle of liberty for all. Of the prominent political figures of his era, only Lincoln would consistently hold these two thoughts in conjunction. Union and freedom were one and the same. One could not be maintained without the other. The picture and the frame were inseparable. You can take down that slide, please. The summer of 1862 was when Lincoln best displayed his use of practical politics to advance his vision. From March to July that year, Lincoln negotiated with Congress and the Union-loyal slave-owning border states. He wanted them to agree to end slavery voluntarily by having the federal government buy all their human property to free them. Once these states, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, gave up the institution, Lincoln reasoned that the rebel states would stop fighting. When conservative Northerners complained about the cost, Lincoln told them it would be no more than the price of 87 days of war, an amazing bargain. On July 12, the border state representatives met with Lincoln and told him no. They argued that slavery would survive the conflict, and they were committed to slavery today, slavery tomorrow, and slavery forever. The very next day, Lincoln was riding in a carriage with two cabinet officers, William Seward and Gideon Welles. He told them that he had decided to issue a proclamation of emancipation, quote, as a military necessity, absolutely essential for the salvation of the Union. Both men were dumbfounded. No president before had ever considered an act that would attack slavery. This would overturn the agreed purpose of the war. No longer would the aim be to restore the Union as it was. Lincoln's companions could not even respond to advise him as they were so overwhelmed by the enormity of his proposal. Lincoln had already written his proclamation. Now he needed to prepare the voters before announcing it. He knew this controversial action would probably lose him political support. Lincoln's campaign to shape public opinion to accept emancipation started with a letter to newspaper editor Horace Greeley that was published on August 22nd. Without revealing that he'd already written his proclamation, Lincoln said that whatever he might do about slavery, he would do to save the country. Some people say, he wrote, they would not save the Union unless they could save slavery. I do not agree with them. Some people say they would not save the Union unless they could destroy slavery. I do not agree with them. My purpose, it said, is to save the Union, regardless if I free no slaves, some slaves, or all slaves. I believe it necessary to save the Union. This is my duty. Now, as a final note, he added, I still wish that all men everywhere could be free. But here Lincoln wanted to keep pressure on both wings of his coalition to stay in the war, knowing that abolitionists were pressing him to end slavery at any cost, and the pro-slavery unionists demanded that slavery continue after the war. To win, he could not afford to lose either group. Next slide, please. Second, Lincoln addressed the appalling racism that dominated the North, even among abolitionists. Most opposed slavery, but did not accept social integration. Black code laws that restricted Black lives still existed in much of the North. His meeting with a group of community leaders, the Colored Gentlemen, in August is today painful to read. The well-publicized speech he made with these leaders, urging them to recruit members of their race to accept colonization and leave the United States for Africa, is bewildering. Since there was no meaningful planning to support this, we know that Lincoln used this message to assuage Northern fears that emancipation would bring vast numbers of freed people north. It is a terrible reminder that small numbers of Black voters were not a political factor to be considered. This battle cry of freedom was a song written by a New York songwriter by the name of George Root in the summer of 1862. While very few people understood the connection that Lincoln was drawing, that union and freedom were inseparable, Root got it, and he wrote one of the most famous songs of the war, the battle cry of freedom, where we would save freedom by keeping the Union together. So this song helped to promote, perhaps unmeaningly, Lincoln's very concept for why the Constitution and the Union were invaluable in winning the war. The emancipation was no short-term win for Lincoln. The proclamation brought criticism from near and far. Enemies at home and in Europe would still portray emancipation as inadequate or desperate or a futile measure by a cruel and evil tyrant. Next slide, please. This is a cartoon that was published by the British journal Punch and shows Lincoln in a desperate card game with the Confederates in which he is holding up the ace of spades. And if you look at it clearly, it's a derogatory stereotype image of a Black man there in the middle. But Lincoln, his hair arranged in the shape of horns. The international community was concerned that this was a desperate measure and that Lincoln was putting a lot of lives at risk through the possibility of servile insurrection, Black people rising up and massacring their masters. So there was a lot of negative publicity throughout the country and across the world for Lincoln issuing the Emancipation. But he did make one final adjustment. The day before he signed the proclamation, Lincoln inserted into that draft an order to enlist Black men in the Army. Removing this long-standing prohibition would no longer prevent Black men from fighting for their country and freedom alongside white men. Lincoln recognized this will soon be important for asserting civil rights for Black citizens. Black liberation and Black soldiers swung the tide of the war. The Fugitive Slave Act would no longer threaten those who fled to freedom. Colored troops replenished the battle-depleted ranks and proved to be worthy fighters. The Union was secured, as Lincoln had predicted, by securing and expanding freedom. Lincoln still continued the fight. He knew that his executive order could not extend beyond the war. He used his political capital to assure the passage of the 13th Amendment before returning the rebel states could stop the process. Only then was his fight won. The apple in the frame, freedom in the Constitution, was secure for all time. The rule of law had been defended, assuring that liberty would sustain within one nation, individual. The political genius, constancy, and persistence of Abraham Lincoln changed our nation for good. Next slide, please. To appreciate Lincoln is to understand his conviction that the United States exists as a unique experiment in human self-government for the purpose of protecting the natural rights of all people. And second, know that he continued to learn and evolve his methods for elevating human rights within the law. The Constitution was the silver frame that protected the picture, the apple of gold, representing liberty and the right to live by the fruits of one's own labor. The protection of human rights was inseparable from the Constitution, the rule of law. If secession was a violation of the law that necessitated war, then slavery could only be ended under the same law. Other politicians pointed to a higher law that justified extra constitutional acts. Lincoln worried that society then becomes untethered to the contract and opens the way to other tyrannies. If a decree would end slavery, he told some clergymen, then John Brown would have done the trick. Binding government action to respect for law and legal process enabled the success of the civil disobedience practices that 100 years later brought down segregation. Abraham Lincoln is worthy of our respect and honor in the public square. His example must be elevated as a reminder and a symbol for all to see. But for Lincoln, no other American politician of his era so consistently united the vision of the Declaration with the power of the Constitution to force the notion of inalienable rights for all into the national consciousness. Lincoln gave us soaring language to describe the aspirational American values, including the importance of consideration for others. And he modeled those values in his respectful behaviors toward minorities and the disaffected. He secured his reputation as humane and a humanitarian. It is right and just that we honor Lincoln because, number one, he caused the nation to stop compromising with the slavery oligarchs. He built a national coalition to resist the expansion of slavery. He alone conceived a strategy built on the view that liberty and union were inseparable, that only a united nation could permanently defeat slavery, and that only ending slavery could save the Union. He led a revolution while preserving the rule of law under the Constitution. And finally, he persisted in a lifelong campaign to constitutionally end slavery forever and open the path for people of African descent to secure equality under the law. That's the reason we honor Lincoln and the principal purpose that he brought to the value of our country. Thank you very much. And Debbie?
To President Lincoln on issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Thou hast spoken. Let the earth resound with hallelujahs to our gracious God. The gladsome news, 4 million men will soon no longer groan beneath the tyrant's rod. Thy words are echoed by 10 million hearts, from hill to dale, to the islands to the sea. They are redemption's chartered harbingers when men, no longer slaves, but free shall be. Thou hast spoken. And a million arms are gleaming brightly from the battle van, and banners proudly waving on the breeze, presaging victory to thy ripening plan. Thou hast spoken, and thy name shall glow forever on Columbia's altar bright. For thou hast stayed a vile despotic tide and bravely battled for the trampled right. May thy footsteps ever lead thee upward, upward to that bright celestial land where safely sheltered from the storm of life, thou'lt join the heroes of the Patriots band. Written by John Willis Menard in the collection of his poetry that Rod Ross already indicated, the first African-American elected to the US Congress in 1868. The poem reflects the fervent exuberance of emancipation. You can hear it in the language, feel the excitement, and honor the phrasing of images and tone. There's a majestic reverence throughout. Why do we honor Abraham Lincoln? Freedom! My next slide shows why we need to recognize that Lincoln lived in a cultural environment where slavery was an accepted way of life, the right to own humans as property and regard them as subhuman. 4 of the 5 presidents, the first 5 presidents, were Virginians with pervasive Southern mentalities that fortified the foundational legacy of slavery. Lincoln had to grapple with how to uproot this wretched institution, or as Menard referred to it, this vile despotic tide, without alienating a sizable portion of the country. He's criticized now for what he did or didn't do or say or didn't say. But as Professor Lucas Morel and others have said and noted, first, he had to get elected. This was just 10 years after the Fugitive Slave Act. Those who felt the exuberance of freedom for what Lincoln accomplished in the conditions honored him. And that's enough for me. There are rituals and images that reflect the honor for Abraham Lincoln. Watch night, December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1862, also known as Freedom's Eve, depicted here showing an anxious anticipation for the Emancipation Proclamation, and this ritual is observed to this day, as you can see in the next slide. The messages on Watch Night on New Year's Eve have changed and gone forward. Instead of referencing slavery as much, we talk more about the celebration, the exuberance, the thankfulness for getting through the year, and praise in preparation for the next year. But these rituals continue through churches and various groups throughout the country after all of these years, including last year, New Year's Eve on Zoom. Lincoln's image was comforting and treasured and placed in Bibles and on mantles for generations and passed through generations. His image is joined by others of like-minded mentality. The next slide shows joined by Kennedy, joined in freedom, stood for freedom and justice. And next slide, indicating with Dr. King. My final slide, brimming with hope and possibility. I have a personal reflection on why we celebrate Abraham Lincoln. When I moved here to Washington, D.C. from Chicago in 1991, I walked along the streets of downtown and looked in the stores, the Woody's and the Hecht's, and saw some of the art stores. And inside, I saw this. Yes, It is a shackle, complete with the noise maker inside. It's something I've never seen walking along the streets in Chicago, State Street or Michigan Avenue. And even when I taught at Alabama State in Montgomery, Alabama, I'm sure the shackles were there. But the fact that you could find something of this nature that was just ubiquitous, sitting around, and so available, so pervasive, is a reminder of how wretched this system was. And the legacy still haunts us to this day. So why we honor Abraham Lincoln? Freedom, emancipation, that's more than a notion. His legacy is honored by the ancestors who bore the brunt of what they were lived through and passed on the strength to honor him today. Thanks for your attention. Now for closing remarks, we're back to John O'Brien.
Debbie, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Abraham Lincoln was an exceptional leader, well matched for the circumstances of his era. It is conceded that honor is also due to those who, through their courage, tenacity, and desire to enjoy liberty, managed to self-emancipate. Both efforts were essential to success. Lincoln was part of a vast enterprise with those who influenced change and the many still unnamed who used their bodies to bring about the victory of freedom. It is also conceded that not all in this country shared in the scope or degree of expanded liberties that were achieved. Because of his transformation of the politics and law of our country, Lincoln should be honored in the public square. Of those who choose to focus on his perceived flaws, we must ask, what alternative outcomes would the nation have experienced without Lincoln? Was there anyone else who might have been capable of guiding the country better or quicker toward a new birth of freedom? None are obvious today, and his contemporaries resoundingly said so. But for Lincoln, no other American leader of his era so consistently united the vision of the Declaration with the power of the Constitution to force the notion of inalienable rights for all into our national consciousness. Lincoln stands with a cloud of witnesses in this change, but his role was derived from the expectations of a nation for leadership and inspiration. He fulfilled his mission in a way that has given us a legacy of language and behaviors to which many still aspire. He deserves our honor and respect for performing his role exceptionally well. Our nation benefits from continuing to lift up his example in the pursuit of justice for all. Thank you very much. Howard, back to you. David, I'm sorry.
I guess I'll take questions, but so far we don't have any. So please put your questions in the Q&A feature so that I can see them, and I will ask those questions. I'll start by answering a question of myself, and that is, who were the 5 civilized tribes that I mentioned? And you could see in the first slide that I put up, the 5 civilized tribes, which of course is the white Americans' name for them, were 5 of the largest tribes in the southeast of the United States, and they were the Cherokee, the Creek, who are also known as the Muskogee, which is, you might know from old country songs, and you hear about Okie from Muskogee, that came from the Creek name. The Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. And they were the tribes that were forced by the Trail of Tears, in the Trail of Tears, out to what is now Oklahoma. Then it was called Indian Territory. And they actually, the Confederacy spent quite a bit of time asking them and working with them to get them to fight for the Confederacy, which many of them did. In large part because they also, many of them had enslaved Black Americans as well. There were about 8,000 enslaved Black Americans that were owned by the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma. So when I mentioned that that there was concern that the Confederacy was instigating uprisings, which is the first belief that occurred in Minnesota with the Dakota uprising, that the Confederates were instigating this. And it turned out they weren't up there, but they were further south. Here's a question, I guess, for John. Can you talk about how Lincoln's views on voting rights, what Lincoln's views for voting rights were for freed male slaves, and how that may have evolved?
The Lincoln's position evolved greatly from his political career through his presidency as new opportunities arose to expand his definition of aspirations. He took it. Clearly, he had voting rights in mind, though unexpressed, when he allowed for Black soldiers to be in the Army. Yes, he needed new troops, but yes, he also understood the connection between emancipation and the need to be able to show that you have participated in the war to be able to expand your rights as a citizen. So by the time his reelection came and he was giving the last speech that he would give, that is from the White House 3 days before his assassination, he did suggest that the next step was to expand voting rights to include African Americans, particularly, again, conceding to the racism of his era, particularly to those who are more educated and those who have fought for their country. So it was the first time that a president had suggested that Black people would ever have the right to vote in this country, and Lincoln did express that before his assassination.
Okay, does maybe Rod knows this? What's the current status of the statue issue in Chicago? You're on mute, Rod.
I understand that the period for comments has closed. You know, Bonnie McDonald, who is a co-chair of the commission, said that, you know, using that hashtag that Howard projected would get interested people to find the recording of this program, that it's a period of limbo. You know, I think it's highly unlikely that Chicago would remove its Lincoln statues, but I don't have an official update.
There's a question, do you think Lincoln's critics are holding a mid-19th century white man to the standards of 2021? And is that fair or unfair?
Well, that's certainly true. There was a wonderful series on CNN recently about Lincoln, and it tried to give this balanced perspective and included some commentary that you cannot excuse what he did on the basis of 19th century America. After all, people like Frederick Douglass did not have those attitudes, and they were of the 19th century. So while accepting that there may be some universal standard that we should be holding historical figures to, it still seems to me important to recognize that for all of the racial attitudes, the enormity of the racism of the 19th century, even among abolitionists who didn't like the idea of slavery, but didn't like the idea of African Americans living next to them. Given the enormity of this racism that's predominated in the country, Lincoln was probably, without question, among the least racist of his time. So, and his policies furthered a reduction of those attitudes and furthered freedom for all.
I agree. In the few years that I've been with the Lincoln Group of DC and been a part of the book discussions, has been very helpful to me to see the extent, the depth of so many of those issues that have been coming out And looking at the racism, even looking at the Confederate positioning of secession. I never really read it until I was part of the group, and then realized all of the states' rights that we were learning about in school, from grammar school on. What was the idea of slavery? What was the Civil War about? States' rights. Well, you read the books and you read the Constitution for the Confederate Constitution, and you see what was actually there. And the fact that we are living in this time where there's so much, the legacy, the ties, the effect, the impact of slavery and emancipation are still with us to this day. So yeah, considering what he was dealing with, where he was, and having to get elected, that gives him not a pass, but just a recognition of being in a place doing the best he could with what he had and where he was.
David, let me relate this to your set of issues as well, just to again reflect on what an extraordinary figure he was as both an American and a politician. In February of 1862, when he was taking the time to review these trial records to pardon the Indians you described, he's also dealing with a major cabinet crisis. His cabinet's resigning. He's got a battle at Fredericksburg, Virginia, in which the army suffered enormous casualties. He's trying to reconstruct the army, reconstruct a cabinet, getting ready for the Emancipation Proclamation. And yet he takes the time, which no other president or politician would do, to review the case records to grant the clemency for the 200 plus men that he did. Truly an extraordinary man. There was no political upside for him to do that, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and that's a good point, that there was no political upside at all to doing anything to reform the existing Indian system. The 99% or whatever of the white population had no problem at all with the Indian system that was in place. There was no pressure from the public or from Congress or on Congress to do anything about it. So Lincoln largely ignored the Native American policy while he was in office. He let the existing Indian policy continue because there wasn't anybody pushing to change it, and he was busy. But he did take some steps. He made some comments in his annual message to Congress, which were, not really very progressive at all, but he did recognize that there was a need to make some changes, and that he promised that he would try to do something about it after the Civil War was over. But at the same time, he also did take the time to listen to Henry Benjamin Whipple, who did speak to Lincoln on behalf of the Dakota who had been sentenced. And he did take the time to meet more than once with John Ross, who was basically the principal chief of the Cherokee Indians, who actually lived in Washington, D.C. for most of the war. And he spoke with Lincoln about the Cherokee situation, which was actually kind of the opposite of what we saw with Dakota. The Cherokee were, in fact, had been helping the Confederacy. And John Ross argued or told Lincoln that, we were kind of forced into it. We didn't really want to. And we really would prefer to just kind of go back to our old ways, although the old ways were obviously not the best way either, but they didn't want to be he didn't want to be associated with the Confederacy, even though the Cherokee Nation did associate with the Confederacy. So it was very complicated. It wasn't something very simple that could be dealt with by making a few changes. It was something that required the kind of effort that, as John discussed, Lincoln made with slavery and emancipation, which was very complicated in itself. So it's really would have been impossible to deal with two huge, long-standing racism problems in the country during that time period. But he made a little bit of inroads. He didn't do what we would have preferred him to do, but he did make some inroads. somebody had asked what his position was on Indian issues prior to his presidency, and he really didn't say much. He had very little experience with the Indian system, with Indian issues. He, of course, had fought in the Black Hawk War, but he didn't actually fight in the Black Hawk War. You know, he just participated in it. So, so he didn't have much experience with Indian issues going on, and he didn't, you know, gain a whole lot while he was in office because of the Civil War. I just said we probably don't have much time left, so I want to get to this as the bigger challenge goes beyond the discussion on statutes. What can your organizations do in the next 12 months to promote social justice to African and Native Americans? And that's where I think we need to focus our energies, all of us, not just our organizations, but individuals. Focus on promoting social justice and trying to rectify some of these lingering problems that are still out there. We see in Minnesota, obviously, right now is the focal point for one trial and then another death that just reiterates that this is the African American still are not treated as equals. And Minnesota is also a location of where a lot of Native American concerns are centered. That last picture I showed is of the annual reconciliation ride that goes from North Dakota to Mankato, sorry, Minnesota, where the 38 were hanged. So there are issues that we all need to follow through on. And Debbie, do you have any other insight on that?
I agree. I mean, just this presentation, I'm looking at the chat and really appreciate the wonderful comments. The fact that we've got two organizations like this getting this information out. I was thinking 2020 was a watershed of what we went through, not, you know, with the pandemic, with our lives, an upheaval, so many ways. We were shaken and stirred. And what's going on now, like you said, to this day, shows that there are things we can work on and work with together somehow as we keep walking and talking together. So that's what I see happening as a hopeful positioning.
I think we have time for one quick question, I think. And this was somebody asked you, Debbie, would you care to comment on the controversy about the Lincoln statue in DC, the Emancipation Memorial?
Oh my, yeah.
And try to deal with that in like 2 minutes.
Right. I have not been at the forefront. Actually, John and David have been there. You were there in the evenings in discussing and being part of the presentations. I recognize the significance of a design flaw, but at the same time recognize what the message is, what the intention has been. So there's, again, talk about being complicated. I would like to hear from you guys as well. We're trying to honor, at the same time, cut down any kind of sense of dishonor, disrespect. But the design is very problematic, I know.
There was major discussion of the statue last summer, of course. Delegate from DC, Norton, has introduced legislation to have the statue removed. What I learned from the debate last summer, though, was not only was it just the image that is problematic for many of a black man bending over before Lincoln, just not looking any further at what the symbols were at the time they were put together, but also that there are people who resent that Lincoln has this reputation as the emancipator. That in fact, they are not willing to concede that he contributed much to the process. Now, how much of the statute discussion gets caught up on these two perspectives, I have to say that I am I have an understanding now of how the image does not sit well with many of our African-American colleagues. And so I am sympathetic to that and trying to find a way to contextualize that differently, change what we can to make that improvement. But I do reject, for the reasons I've given today, any argument that Lincoln was not responsible for the change of our law, the change of our culture, which has allowed us to continue this progression of looking for how we can perfect our society. Lincoln's experience, Lincoln's example is relevant to what we have to go through today. And so continue to press on those principles and find ways of achieving the change we still need, I think is an important part of why we study Abraham Lincoln and why we should continue to honor him.
No, I think that in looking at the two statues, one needs to look at the two statues that are in Lincoln Park, roughly a mile to the east of the Capitol building. So what are the two statues? One is the Emancipation statue that has Lincoln standing and the former enslaved Archer Alexander rising, one could say. A couple of decades ago, a second statue was put up to Mary McLeod Bethune, one of the most joyous statues in Washington, a Black educator with 2 children. So when the Bethune statue was put up, the Lincoln statue was turned reversed so that Lincoln's back was to the Capitol and he was facing the Bethune statue. Later this year, the state of Florida will remove one of its 2 statues in the Statuary Hall collection and replace it with a statue to Mary McLeod Bethune. My personal solution is simply change the degree of the statue of emancipation so that it's Archer Alexander looking to the future, to the present, to 2021, with recognition of, by the state of Florida, of Mary McLeod Bethune as a true national hero.
We do have a few more questions, but I understand that our time is up, Rod. Or do you want to take more questions?
Well, Howard, can we have a few more questions?
I think we can take a few questions. I think the recording may cut off for future showing, but
yeah. By the way, somebody did ask, will this recording be made available? And yes, it will be made available, and it is being made available to the Chicago Statues Commission, and they may even be online watching this at the moment. I think that we can continue as long as anybody wants to continue, unless somebody tells me otherwise. So I'll just a couple of more things here. So one is like, what is about our backgrounds, our individual backgrounds, that explains our interest in Lincoln as opposed to Washington or Jefferson. And I guess I'll start by saying I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I was probably the only Lincoln geek in my hometown, which calls itself the birthplace of American independence. So we were, as a town, we're much more focused on our own role in the Revolutionary War. And we talked about the Civil War, but not nearly in the detail that I'm sure other people talked about the Civil War. So I was kind of unique standing out in my class as being somebody who was interested in Lincoln. But I always thought of him as somebody, and it goes to the topic of this discussion. I always thought of him as somebody to honor, to somebody to look up to, somebody who's just natural integrity and honesty was something to aspire to. And that's why I got interested in Lincoln. He was somebody who dealt with a very obviously difficult time in our history. And I don't know how many other people would have been able to get us through it. And, you know, he may not have done everything exactly perfect the way we would like to see it today, but, you know, he got us through a time, and as John mentioned, a time period when very few other people would have even tried to pull us together and to keep us together. So that's how I got involved. What
Being
about you,
from
Debbie?
Chicago, that was kind of a natural for me, but my focus actually became more intense once I moved here to Washington, D.C. and was there at the Ford Theater, looking at presentations by the Lincoln Group. One of the first ones I attended was Lincoln, Emancipation and Race. I met my life partner there. Seeing across the street the house where, you know, he actually died, and then having all of that history right underfoot here in Washington was a major impetus for me. So studying and trying to bring other people of color into these rooms and in the discussions has been kind of difficult. I keep bringing out to my friends and how about this? Take a look at the exciting things we're doing here. And often people just kind of just say that's the past. I don't want to deal with that part. But what's going on now, when I'm going through elections and you see when these issues that we're studying from 1860 could apply to 2016, it's like, okay, there's some history we need to come to grips with as we go forward in the country. So that's been, he's been my anchor as I was getting through some of the tough couple of years. I could always go back and find out where Lincoln was and the actual trials and tribulations of what people went through to get where we are today.
So I'm a little bit embarrassed to say my interest, what got me into Lincoln was his wife, Mary. 1875, there was a Cook County court that convicted Mary Lincoln of being a lunatic, and she was sent to a private sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. Fast forward to 1946, and my family moved to that sanitarium when my father took over operation of the institution. So we initially lived on the second floor where Mary Lincoln actually lived. My childhood and early adult objective was to write the definitive account of Mary Lincoln's 4 unhappy months in 1875 there in Batavia. I did. It got published in the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society. I went to Knox College and went through Old Main, which is one of the places where the Lincoln-Douglas debates took place. Spent time in Chicago, spent time here in Washington. How could one not be imbued with Abraham Lincoln?
My father took me to the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg reenactment. I'd been interested in Civil War issues until that time, and at Gettysburg, became much more interested in the Gettysburg Address. How could one man write such a beautiful speech to capture the essence of the conflict and the hopes of the nation? And so from that began a lifelong appreciation for learning more about what motivated, what inspired, and what principles he was able to develop for us. His career as a politician and making all that happen has been extraordinarily interesting for me.
I'm wondering, people have asked, what can we do? Maybe, I guess, Debbie and I answered this a little bit, but John, maybe you can kind of explain or give some ideas of what the Lincoln Group is doing, or what you think the general public can do to get the word out. And I mean, I would say at first, get educated, but which is part of why we're doing this, is to help people understand get a broader understanding of the issues. What else is there, John?
The principles are still relevant. The strategies may change, the methods, but the principles are still relevant. The issues still ring today as they did in the 19th century. We have study groups. The Lincoln Group is now reading How the South Won the Civil War, a book by historian Heather Richardson Cox, which describes the development of the concept of white supremacy and how Reconstruction and the development of the American West reinforced some elements which we still have to grapple with and learn how to overcome, interact with, to make sense of today, to secure a greater sense of equal justice in this country. So exploring those issues in a historic sense and updating them to how they are relevant to understand today and become part of the history that we have to navigate to be able to set a better course today. These are the types of things which discussion of Lincoln and the Lincoln Group activities are helping with us today.
We were going to put our website in the chat as well.
Good, Lincolnian.org. We try to post relevant stories. We have several people who have been trying to track the relationship of not only Lincoln history, but also social issues as they relate to Lincoln's concept of justice and how we can be better informed on those today. Lincolnian.org. I encourage you to go to the website and send us your ideas for making it better.
I just put that in the chat. One of the things that we would like to do is to help provide people with all the background information on these issues, because we do tend to see, people mention, well, it was the largest mass execution in U.S. history, and that's absolutely true. In part because we're not in the habit of mass executing people. We don't do it very often. So it's rather unique when it does happen. And in that case, and Lincoln explained the situation to Congress, that he reviewed all the cases and he decided that some of the standards being used were inadequate and he had stricter standards. But at the same time, there were people killed. There were murders of white settlers, and he felt that it was necessary for there to be for some of the people who were guilty to actually be executed, because that was the law, that they be executed for massacres and for murders, and that held for whites who massacred other people as well. So it was kind of like, well, we can't just let everybody off because they're guilty. But on the other hand, some of these people really aren't that guilty. Some of the 303, these 265, they really didn't have a very good record to show that they're guilt. But for the 38, they did. And so you could argue that it was justified that they were executed according to the laws of the time. And it gets very complicated. And that's why it's important for us to learn more than just the very short largest mass execution in US history. That doesn't tell us a lot about what really happened. And there was quite a bit going on in the country, most of which Lincoln was not very much involved with. He had peripheral involvement in Dakota before getting the case files. Early on, he was told, well, there's a massacre going on, there's an uprising, the Dakota are killing all these white people. What do we do about it? And he's basically said, well, I've got a civil war going on. Handle it. That's what your job is. You'll handle it. And he sent out General Pope, who had just lost in Second Bull Run, and said, I'll send him out, and and he can help the local people deal with it. So he basically just said, well, that's your part. Remember, this is a time period where even with telegraph, there weren't telegraphs to every place in the country. And communication was still slow, and it was still kind of spotty. So a lot of things happened at the local level that Lincoln found out about later on. And that's true for all of the presidents before that as well. In fact, even more so before telegraph. So we have been getting quite a few, by the way, comments saying that they appreciate that we're doing this, and that they did learn a lot. So that's our goal. That's Rod's goal.
And I'll take that and run.
The Illinois State Society and the Lincoln Group's goal, and all of our participants' goal, is to help people understand this better. And we obviously can't cover everything. There's a lot more about our Indian system and Lincoln's role that could be and should be gone into in a much in a larger venue. But so Rod, I would say that at this point we should probably wrap this up.
I concur. So we can say shalom. Thank you all for coming. It has been wonderful. I'm so appreciative of the three main panelists, Debbie Jackson, freedom, wonderful, John O'Brien, intellectually great, David, explaining to many, including myself, why it is that some Lincoln statues were defaced by Native Americans. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to Howard Marks for hosting this event as a Illinois State Society webinar. So the next webinar series in the same sequence will be Gary Eckelbarger speaking on May the 21st, May the 11th, on John A. Blackjack Logan and the Logan statue in Chicago. Take care.